So we are on the book of Revelation, and last week we just about completed the first chapter. Just to do a quick review, in the first chapter we have the background information. John was on the Isle of Patmos, and he had a vision. In the vision, he was taken forward to the day of the Lord, and he saw events that would take place on that day of the Lord. He had a vision of Jesus and a very detailed description where the last thing that Jesus said was that he was to write the things that he saw and to put them in a book and send them to the 7 churches. Now let me quickly let me bring up our slides, because what we want to do is to look at, just remind ourselves. So in his vision, John saw a description of Jesus. He saw an image of Jesus, a vision of Jesus that maybe looked a little bit like this, with a sharp sword coming out of his mouth, with the 7 stars in his right hand, a golden girdle around his waist, feet like the burning of furnace, eyes like a flame of fire, the hair of his head like the pure wool, and he was walking in the midst of 7 candlesticks. Now, John was told specifically that the 7 stars represent the 7 angels, or the 7 messengers of the churches, and that the 7 candlesticks, or the 7 lampstands, represented the 7 churches. Now, I admit that there's one part of Revelation that I've been a little sketchy in my approach to it, and it is the 7 churches. I mean, I've studied it along with Revelation for many years, but the thing is that it just seems a little bit out of sync with the rest of the book. I know that the message of the book is the judgment of the kingdoms, that I am absolutely certain about. And I know that the narrative begins in Revelation chapter 4. So these 2 chapters dealing with the 7 churches, chapters 2 and chapter 3, they have created a bit of a conundrum in my mind, because I'm thinking, where do these 7 churches fit into the picture of the judgment? Are they just vague messages sent out to the churches? And this evening I hope I can answer those questions a little better. So last week we reminded ourselves that these 7 churches were actually literal churches in what is now modern day Turkey. In Bible times it was referred to as Asia. That part was Asia, and I think they call it Asia Minor. But and we also saw that these 7 churches were in the same order. If you went in a semicircle, if you follow the actual path of these churches, it would take you in a semicircle like this, and they would actually be in the same order in which Jesus sent the messages in Revelation. So they were one behind the other. But most Christians agree that these 7 churches represented not the 7 literal churches primarily. I'm sure that John sent the message to these 7 literal churches because they were local congregations back there in Bible times. But everybody agrees, or almost everybody agrees, that these 7 churches represented something bigger. All of us understand the principle of type and antitype. So these 7 churches were actually, you might call them types. They were They were illustrative of the bigger Christian church. And these messages were applicable to the Christian church, especially down at the end of time. But Jesus sent the messages to these 7 literal churches. And if you look at the pattern of the book of Revelation, it's understandable, because in Revelation, for example, when God talks about Babylon, he's really talking about some greater system. There actually was a Babylon in Bible times. And even in the time when John wrote the book of Revelation, there was a Babylon. But when God talked about Babylon, he was not speaking about that local Babylon. He was talking about something much bigger and greater, encompassing the whole world. It's the same thing with these 7 churches. He talks about Ephesus. It's not primarily focused on that little Ephesus that was down there in Asia Minor. And all the different churches, for example, all of them had to do with something bigger. And that is the pattern of Revelation. All right, so first thing I want to look at is the meaning of the names. Now, there were 7 of them. And you can actually see in Revelation chapter 1 where the names are given, because where does he say it? Right, in verse 11. Jesus says, "What you see, write in a book and send it unto the 7 churches which are in Asia." And he tells you the names: unto Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. So, because we know that everything in Revelation has meaning, the first thing we want to do is look at the meanings of these names, and they are significant. So, the first name, Ephesus. The literal meaning of the word Ephesus is desirable, and it is typical of what we know about this church, because Ephesus was described by Jesus as having, it was known for hard work. And most of the things that Jesus has to say about this church are commendable. A lot of good said about it. So the name desirable is typical of the kind of church that Ephesus was described as being. The next church was what? Smyrna. And Smyrna comes from the name myrrh. And most of us will know that myrrh was a bitter herb that had a smell. The smell of myrrh was, I think it was a sweet smell, but the herb itself was bitter. And we will read the description. We will come to the descriptions one at a time. But Smyrna was a church of persecuted believers. And they were described as experiencing a lot of suffering. And there was a threat of death. In the message that was sent, there was a suggestion that death would be a prominent part of their experience. The next church was Pergamos. And Pergamos, it can have 2 meanings. It can mean married, or it can mean a citadel. Now, people sometimes interpret it as meaning married to the world, and that wouldn't be too off, because Pergamos was really probably the first church that began to have heavy criticism from Jesus. And the commentary, most people comment, most commentators suggest it represents a church that compromised with the world. And as I said, we'll come to the message itself and we'll look at these things in a bit more detail. The next church was Thyatira. And the word Thyatira means continual sacrifice, or a smell of affliction. And this church was noted, when you read what it says about this church, it was noted for tolerating false teaching. Now, there's something about these messages that I will point out as we go through them. But the thing is, as you look at these messages, it's like you're talking to two different sets of people. Because Jesus will say, you have there that woman who is teaching my servants, that woman Jezebel. So Thyatira is not the woman Jezebel. But Thyatira is living in the time of the woman Jezebel and under the influence of the woman Jezebel. So it's like the message is addressing two different situations. The woman Jezebel and the church of Thyatira. And you'll find that many of the messages are like that. They are focused on two things. And I want to point out that one thing is referring to God's people. The other thing is referring to something that is present, that is not God's people, but it appears to be God's people. And I'll say some more about that as we proceed. Then after Thyatira, you had Sardis. And the word Sardis means a remnant, or the ones who escape. Sardis is described as a church that was dead, although it has a name for being alive. All of these names are very, very appropriate when you begin to get down into the churches and understanding what they mean. Like I said, we'll come to that. There are two churches left. You have Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis. The next one is Philadelphia. And the word Philadelphia means brotherly love. Now, this morning when we were listening to Daniel talking about the seal of God and the mark of the beast, this was a nice thing to look at, the character of Philadelphia, because Philadelphia is identified as being outstanding. It says they have a little strength, but they are faithful and they endure and they have a lot of zeal for the work. But the name itself means brotherly love. And when we look at the idea that the seal of God has to do with the love of God, this is a very strong evidence that we could look at. The name itself of Philadelphia. And certainly, as we are continuing with our studies and we come to Philadelphia, I'm going to highlight that a little bit more. And then the last of the churches is, of course, Laodicea. And Laodicea means the judging of the people. Well, they say it could also mean the custom of the people. But I think the judging of the people is a very significant title. And of course, it is described as being lukewarm, self-sufficient, full of itself, self-righteous. And Laodicea has one of the worst indictments against it by Jesus. As a matter of fact, when you look at all the churches, Laodicea is the only one that really, you could say, there's no encouragement or any hope that Jesus gives to this church. Now, what do these 7 churches represent? What do they represent? That is something that I've battered with that question for a while. This evening I'm going to suggest something. I'm going to suggest some meanings. But last week I highlighted something that I'm going to repeat, which is that I've come to the conclusion that, there are 2 approaches that people take. I know that most of them say that these 7 churches, they represent 7 stages in the history of the Christian church. So they will say that Ephesus represented from the time of the apostles until about AD 100. Then they will say that Smyrna was about AD 100 to about AD 313, a time of great persecution. And then they will say Pergamos was from about 300 to about 538. And then they will say Thyatira was from about 538 until about 1715 or 1798, some people will say. And they will say Sardis was from 1715. Sardis was from 1715 until 1844. And then they will say Philadelphia was like from 1844 until sometime about in the 1860s, and then Laodicea was from in the 1860s until today. That's how they will put it. But I'm going to reorganize it a little bit, and I'm going to say each of these 7 churches, it had a starting point, but none of them has an ending point. So where they would say that Ephesus started in AD 31 when Jesus died, or with the beginning of the apostolic church, and they would say it came to an end in AD 100. I'm saying no, Ephesus never ended. And then Smyrna began, and it never ended. And then Pergamos began, and it never ended. And Thyatira began, and it never ended. And so you come to the end of time, and all 7 of these churches are still in existence. This is what I want to demonstrate. Now, if you look at the churches as organizations, then of course some of them passed away, right? For example, the Apostolic Church. If you look at it as an organization where you had 12 apostles in charge of it, and I don't know if they gave themselves a name. I don't know that they had a name. They were probably just called Christians. But the organizational structure, it doesn't exist anymore. That phase of the church, it did pass, and the church went through changes, the organized church. But I don't think the Bible is looking, I don't think Revelation especially is looking at things like this. Revelation is looking at spiritual entities, spiritual things. So you can know that, for example, Israel is not the organization called Israel. It's not the Jews. It's not the Hebrews. Israel is the spiritual company that is made up of people who have the Spirit of Christ in them. They're not in Jamaica or in Croatia or in the United States or India or China. They are everywhere. Wherever the Spirit of God is, that is where Israel is. They are identified by something spiritual. So it's not a church or a congregation the way we understand congregations. It's something bigger and greater. It's a spiritual congregation that you recognize by their spiritual characteristics, not by their physical attributes. You see what I'm saying? If you're looking for physical Israel, you better go down to Palestine and go down to there in the Middle East. Or you can say there are Jews everywhere, but you're going to be looking for the kind of blood, the kind of skin tone, and the kind of face and nose and so forth. You're looking for physical things. But true Israel is spiritual. The identifying mark is invisible. And it is so with most of the things in Revelation. So the 7 churches, we are not to go to Asia to look for them. Neither are we to go to a certain location in time. We are looking at spiritual conditions, and these conditions started at a certain point in time, but they all continue to the end of time. Now, what we are looking for then, what I was looking for, I asked myself, is that Brother Patrick?
Yeah. So
Yes.
you're saying the churches are like the beast power, just using a different head every single time?
I suppose we could say there is that similarity. It's one church, but with 7 different incarnations, we could say. There's a similarity, Brother Patrick. Yes, you could look at it that way. I mean, of course, we want everybody to understand that we are saying the beast power, of course, the heads are negative, but the church, these different states of the church are mostly positive. So it's different in that way. But yes, the comparison you're making is an interesting one that I didn't think about, but you could say so. Just like how the beasts had heads and they all came into existence at different times. The difference is that they don't all exist at the end of time. The 7 heads of the beast, they do not all exist. But I'm saying that the 7 states of the church, they all exist down at the end of time. And why am I emphasizing this? Well, the reason is because Revelation is an end time book. If God gives messages to the 7 churches, and the book of Revelation is to be sent to the 7 churches, it is because the book of Revelation is important to the 7 churches. If one of the churches was eliminated AD 100, say for example Ephesus, started in AD 31, continued to AD 100, what is the point of sending the book of Revelation? It means nothing to the church of Ephesus then, because Ephesus does not exist at the time when Revelation is fulfilled. You see what I'm saying? So if God says, if Jesus says, send these letters to the 7 churches, even though you have the literal 7 churches, but the point is he's saying that these messages are important to the 7 churches, the true 7 churches, the bigger 7 churches. These messages have importance to the church in its 7 stages. How can that be if some stages are already gone? So my understanding then is that all 7 stages of the church will exist at the time when Revelation is fulfilled, or during what is called the day of the Lord. All 7 stages are going to be there. I hope that is understandable. If there's any ambiguity and it's difficult to get what I'm saying, then by all means you can interrupt me. But I'm going to repeat it. So all of them had a different starting point, but they all have the same ending point. They're all existing together in our day, and they will continue unto the day of the Lord, which is the fulfillment of the book of Revelation. So the question is, so I started looking around, trying to find 7 different states of the Christian church. Now I can find 32,000 denominations. I think it may be about 40,000 by now. I don't know. I think if you check Wikipedia or you check on the internet, it will tell you there are over 30,000 different denominations. So we're not talking about the denominations. But what we are looking at is 7 great conditions into which you can divide the Christian church. So I was thinking about this and praying about this, and I came upon 7. I came upon 7 actually. So I'm going to try to share those. But I want to say again that when we are looking at prophecy, we are prone to be misguided because we are not perfect and our understanding or our ears are not always perfect to hear exactly what the Lord is saying. But these 7 make sense to me. All right, so let me go back to my screen and I'm going to look at these, what I consider the 7 stages of the Christian church. So, first condition I want to point out. All right, this is something that we said already. These conditions overlap. They all exist together. 7 conditions in the Christian church today. But they relate to specific situations. And all of these situations had a specific beginning. And from that point, they continue right down to the end. So let me highlight some things here because I want to make sure these conditions overlap, meaning that all of these 7 stages, you might have, for example, somebody who is in Ephesus and also in Thyatira, for example. That's what I mean when I say these conditions overlap. You might have somebody whose spiritual condition means that he's a part of Smyrna and he's also a part of Philadelphia, for example. That might happen. But that is not the main way of identifying them. They relate to specific situations. You can look at a certain situation and say, this is the Ephesus situation. And it is one major situation in the world today. You can look at the Smyrna situation and you can say it is one major situation in the world. You can look at all of those 7 churches and you can identify 7 major aspects of the Christian church as you look at each one of them. All of them had a specific beginning. You can point to a time when they actually started, and you can see that from that time they continued until today. All right, those are the things we are looking for. So I'm going to put my suggestions forward, and if you have a disagreement with what I'm going to share, then by all means state your disagreement, but I'm going to ask you to disagree with good reason. And if you don't have good reason to disagree, then hold your peace. All right? I am not infallible, so if I am wrong and you have good reason, I want to see. But if not, then hold your peace. All right. So here's what I see as Ephesus. First of all, Ephesus was the beginning of the Christian church. It began with the first apostles and the early church. And the hallmark of Ephesus, as far as I can see, was that it represented Christians who were living under oppressive rival religions. What do I mean by this? Well, in the apostolic church, what was the environment they lived under? They lived under primarily persecution from the Jews. The Jews was a rival. It was Judaism, but there was some element of it also from, the worshippers of Diana, the Greeks, and the Roman religion, Mithraism to some extent. But in the time of the apostles, remember, the main persecution was from religion. Remember, the people that gave the early church the hardest time was the Jews. They stoned Stephen to death. They put Peter in prison, even when James was beheaded. The church, the religious group, the Jews were behind it. When the Christians had to flee from Jerusalem, it was because after the death of Stephen, there was a great persecution and everybody had to flee. The greatest thorn in the side of the Apostle Paul was the Jews. And sometimes when the Romans did get involved, it was because the Jews instigated them against the Christians. So this was the church of Ephesus, the first church where God says, we're going to look at what he says about Ephesus, but let me just look at what I believe to be the identity of these churches first of all, then we'll go to them individually. So I think Ephesus represents Christians who live under oppressive rival religions. Now, do we have those situations in the world today? From the time of the apostles, it has always been there. What am I talking about? Well, what about Christians who live under extreme Islam? What about Christians who live under extreme Hinduism? There are places in India, there are places in the Middle East, in Islamic countries, where Christians have to live in under severe persecution. Their ability to preach the message is just like in the time of the apostles. They can be killed just for telling somebody about Christ. You can be killed in some countries. Now, here's something I will tell you about Christianity in these countries. There's something that we might have recognized, but I'm going to reinforce it. When you live in a country where there is persecution of Christians, strong persecution by other religions, whether you are a Baptist or an Adventist or a Methodist or a Presbyterian or even a Catholic, is not very significant. If you read the experience of Christians who live under those conditions, all Christians tend to link together. and they tend to help one another, and they don't have time to fight among one another, because the oppression of the other religious forces are so strong. They don't have time to fight among one another. They tend to more band together for their own safety. They work together, cooperate together. Brother Tony, I think you're unmuted. So, this condition, from the days of the Apostolic Church, it has never changed. Somewhere in the world, you have always had Christians who are living under this kind of oppression. And I know that sometimes I ask myself the question, why is it that some Christians are persecuted so badly? And you know, those of us who live in the Western world, we talk about one day persecution is coming, but somebody will say, no, right now, Christians are being severely persecuted in other parts of the world for their religious faith. There are other religious groups that are persecuting Christians. Sometimes, I don't know, some of the news you get is you can't trust it. But if we are to believe everything, in Nigeria, for example, in some places, hundreds of Christians are sometimes killed by Islamic groups. And not just in Nigeria, it happens some places in India where it's very dangerous to be a Christian and try to share your faith. So the same conditions that existed in apostolic times, the same kind of persecution, it exists. There is a part of the church in the world today which is experiencing the same kind of persecution, the same Ephesus conditions, even though it's not the entire church, it's that aspect of the church. And usually Christians under those conditions tend to be far more committed and far more in love with the Lord than the other Christians who live in places where, you know, nothing like that is happening. So what I'm saying is that the Ephesus condition is speaking of the state of the church who lives under, those Christians are the part of the church that lives under oppressive, I'm emphasizing the word oppressive, because if you're living with other religions and they're not making any trouble at all, they're allowing you to survive and do your own business, it doesn't apply. But we are talking about those who live in a place where just to be a Christian, the other dominant religious group will cause severe persecution. This is Ephesus, and it exists in the world today just the same. Number 2, Smyrna. And of course, Ephesus means desirable. Smyrna, it refers to Christians in a similar condition. And I'm suggesting that it refers to Christians who live a similar situation, but this time the enemy is different. It's a godless, persecuting state. When I say state, I mean political system. So in the case of Ephesus, it's the religion that is persecuting. In the case of Smyrna, it's the state that is persecuting. Now, how do I come to this conclusion? Well, first of all, if you look at the second stage of the Christian church after the time of the apostles, for the next 300 years, the church was severely persecuted by the Roman government. Remember, up to about AD 100, the great persecuting power was the Jews. They were the persecutors of Christians. But round about AD 100, the real enemy became the Roman government. And you know that was a time when God said to the church of Smyrna, you will suffer tribulation for 10 days. And it talks about death. That message has references to death. And that was a time when the Emperor Nero, he would dip Christians in tar and use them to light his garden at night. He got the people to hate Christians, that they were slaughtered by the hundreds. So when did this stop? And again, I would say that this never stopped. There was always, from that time going forward, always somewhere in the world, Christians who are being persecuted by the state. Right now, today, you can look at China, you can look at North Korea. During the communist revolution in Russia, you had, I don't know how many thousands of Christians who were killed. During the time of the French Revolution, they slaughtered Christians. Some of them were fake Christians, yes, but they turned against Christianity. And yes, somebody says Iran, and Iran is a combination of religious and state persecution. So I'm making a distinction between Ephesus, which refers to the church in a state where they are oppressed by rival religions, and Smyrna, which refers to the church in a state where it is under persecution by a godless government or a godless state. You might refer to them as atheists sometimes, but it's where the state turns against Christians. Now, these are two conditions that exist in the world today, and they have always existed from the beginning. Well, you had, first of all, the religious persecution, as I pointed out, and then about AD 100, you had the state persecution beginning with fierce intensity, and it continued for about the better part of 300 years. All right. The next part of the church, let me complete my sentence. It continued for the better part of 300 years, and it has never stopped. Somewhere in the world, always from that time forward, you have always had God's people being persecuted by governments and by states, always somewhere. So Smyrna never stopped once it started. The third one is Pergamos. Now, this is one that I couldn't quite figure out. I didn't know this, but I'm going to say something to you that I just found out while I was looking at this. Did you know that there are 3 groups in Christianity? I didn't know. I kind of didn't know my history so well. The people who live in Europe, they will have a better idea than me. But I thought there was only Catholics and Protestants. And I'm willing to conclude that most of you are probably in my shoes. I thought there were only Catholics and Protestants in Christianity. But if you go to Wikipedia or you go to one of these AI search things and ask, how many different groups are there in Christianity? How many major groups? You'll find that there are 3. So I have it on the screen. I should have asked you before I put it on the screen. But I didn't realize that the Orthodox Church is another branch of Christianity, different from Catholicism and different from Protestantism. I didn't realize it. When I go to Europe, they're always talking about the Orthodox Church. When I go to especially Eastern Europe, Croatia, Serbia, Romania, those places, and I ask what is the main religion, they will say the Orthodox Church. And in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, it's just another variation of Catholicism, or it's just another variation of Protestantism. But then I did some more careful study this week, and I discovered that the Orthodox Church is actually a split from the Roman Catholic Church, which took place 1,000 years ago. Now, we know about the split of Protestantism, but most of us didn't really think much about the split of the Orthodox Church, because those who live in Europe, they are much more closely connected to it. In Russia, for example, almost all religion is the Orthodox Church. And if you go to, like I said, the Eastern European countries, if you ask what is the chief religion here, you're not going to hear Catholicism or Protestantism. Most of the time it will be the Orthodox Church. So they broke away from the Catholic Church and became a completely separate entity. The main difference is that they don't acknowledge the Pope as being the head of the church. They have another man that they call a patriarch, and he's the head of the Orthodox Church. But they also had a part of the reason why they split as well was because the Catholic Church says that at the Council of Nicaea, they said that the Holy Ghost proceeds from the Father. And then the Catholic Church says, after a while, the Catholic Church changed and they said the Holy Ghost proceeds from the Father and the Son. And this Orthodox Church, they said, no, that is breaking the tradition that what we got from Nicaea. The Holy Ghost comes only from the Father. And so because of this, they began to have a difference of opinion and they began to split. And then finally, the Pope excommunicated the head of the Eastern Church, the Patriarch. And in return, the Patriarch excommunicated the Pope. Both of them were exercising authority over one another. And because of that, there was this great split. I think they call it the Great Schism. There was this great split, and they split into two different churches. So there are two churches who are similar in the things that they believe. They have smaller differences. But the Orthodox Church does not acknowledge the headship of the Pope. And the Pope, of course, they count that church as heresy. But it's a big body of Christians, even though in our part of the world, we don't know much about them. But there are over 300 million in the Orthodox Church, which is as many people as live in the United States. So it's a very, very huge body of people. Brother Tony, go ahead.
So the Orthodox Church, is it mainly combined of Jews, and do they adhere to the old law precepts?
No, they are just like Catholics. There are people who are made up of Europeans, mostly, because it's mostly in Europe, but there are Romanians, there are Croatians, Serbians, Russians, Ukrainians. There are people from that side of the world who, just like how you have a lot of people belonging to the Catholic Church from different countries, maybe one or two Jews in the lot too, just like you have Jews in Christianity. But primarily, it's a religion. It's not based upon race or nation. It's based upon regarding this church as a church of God, and regarding this man as the head of the church. And just before Brother Cliff speaks, interestingly, if you look at the message to Pergamos, which we will, you will find where it says that that Antipas, my servant, was killed. Now the word Antipas, if you look at the root of the word, it means anti-pope. Anti-pope. So the idea that the Orthodox Church broke away from the Catholic Church because they rejected the Pope, the authority of the Pope. There's a hint of it there in the message to Pergamos. But we'll look at that more closely as we proceed. Go ahead, Brother Cliff.
No, I was just going to let you know that I had an aunt that passed in, what is it? I think it was in August or November. Anyway, she was an Episcopalian. She lived in New Orleans. I didn't know that it was a church other than a Catholic church, because at the funeral they did all the Catholic things, the sprinkling of essence onto the body, onto the congregation, the holy, the holy water, and doing all the rituals as a Catholic. And then I spoke to the officiating the officiating lady afterwards, and in the conversation mentioned the Pope, and she said, "Oh, we don't have a Pope." I said, "You don't have a Pope? You're Catholic, aren't you?" She said, "We follow their practices, but we have our own guy." And I think it was the same person you mentioned. So yeah, they're very prevalent, and we as Adventists, we don't really know about this existence.
Mm-hmm. All right. The thing is, I think Episcopalian is more a version of the Anglican Church. It's the American branch of the Anglican Church, I think. But you're right that they also are very closely imitators of the Catholic way of worship.
Mm.
But it's a little different because the head of their church is supposed to be the queen. I'm not sure if the American branch holds to the same philosophy, but I know that in England the head is the queen or the king, whoever it is, the king or the queen. But
Okay.
yes, but the Orthodox Church is very similar. Now, the Orthodox Church, as I pointed out, has a congregation of 300 million, and it is recognized historically that there are these three branches of Christianity. So, when you read the message to the Pergamos, which we will come to, we will see that many of the statements that are made really fit well with this Orthodox Church. Then the fourth one is Thyatira. And because of the message, I will say that Thyatira represents Christians who are living under Roman Catholicism. Whether they are members of the church or they live under the strong influence of the church, but Thyatira is unmistakably Christians under this influence or under this environment. It's a church to which Jesus says, you suffer that woman named Jezebel to seduce my servants. As I said, there are two people being addressed. There is a church itself, which is made up of the Christians who live under the system. And then the system now is referred to as that woman Jezebel. Two different facets. So even though you might be under the influence or in the environment of Catholicism, you may still be a true Christian, but you're allowing that woman Jezebel to prosper and to survive, according to how the message is written. And we will discuss it more carefully when we come to it. Then after Thyatira, the fifth church is Sardis. And Sardis, unmistakably, as far as I'm concerned, represents Christians who are living under Protestantism. And these three groups cover almost the entire spectrum of Christianity. There is the Orthodox Church with 300 million. There is the Catholic Church with 1.3 billion. And there's a Protestant church, which is made up of all these different denominations, with approximately 1 billion. Roman Catholicism is the biggest group, but you have the Orthodox Church and the Protestantism also included. Now, as I keep repeating, we are going to look at these messages one by one. And what we will see is that they all apply. You can look at them and see how they apply to each of these institutions. And what I want to point out to you is that, okay, we say that the first one, Ephesus, started at the time of the death of Jesus, continues to the end. Smyrna, Christians under a persecuting state, that condition started when the Romans started their persecution of Christians about AD 100, maybe a little before, but it really exploded around about AD 100, and it has continued until today. Christians under the Orthodox Church, it started sometime after the Council of Nicaea. Before the year 1000, it really went into a clear split between them and Catholicism about AD 1000. And that has continued until today. The Roman Catholic Church began the same time as the Orthodox Church, split from them about 1,000 years ago, and has continued until today. And they are about 1.3 billion. Protestantism began to, it was a process that took place over time. From the time that they burned John Huss and Jerome, Martin Luther's theses, 1517, that marked a huge turning point in the Reformation and the growth of Protestantism. So I would say about 1517 is where you had the beginning of the Protestant movement, and that has continued until today. It has grown to about 1 billion people. It includes Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, Adventists, Moravians, all of them. And it continues to be about 1 billion. today, continues until the end. And then the sixth congregation is Philadelphia. And I'm going to give this a label. For the first time in my life, I'm giving it this label, but it is what I have believed. I believe the Philadelphia church is made up of Christians who live under the movement of the little book. Why am I referring to it this way? Because I think that is what Revelation is about. It's about a people who break into God's will for the time because of their eating of the little book, because of their understanding of the little book. Their experience becomes the experience of brotherly love, and all the things that are said of Philadelphia become their experience because of the little book. Now, here's the part where I'm a little cautious. I am thinking up to this point, I'm still thinking that this little book movement began round about the time of the beginning of the Adventist movement. All right? I think the little book movement began when there was this intense study of Daniel and Revelation. And regardless of the fact that there were some wrong ideas, I still think that the movement was a movement of God. And it started with Christians who were sincere and committed and loving and who were absolutely focused on the coming of Jesus. These Christians, this movement, has continued until today. And I believe that those of us in this congregation, in this fellowship this evening, are a part of the movement. Now, this is not to confuse us with the offshoot that came out of the movement. Laodicea. Who is Laodicea? Laodicea is Christians who are under the little book movement. They're under the little book movement apostasy. That's what Laodicea is. People who have been involved with the movement of the little book, but they have gone into apostasy. In other words, they have moved away from that first brotherly love. They have moved away from the elements of Philadelphia. They have organized themselves into a group that is not building on what Philadelphia was given. They're not building on the truths of the little book movement. And they actually become another movement at the end of time, which coexists with the little book movement. And they are really a movement in apostasy. They are self-righteous. They claim to have the truth. They think they are rich and increased with goods, but they have turned away from the path of truth. Now, who are these? I will leave us to make our own conclusion. But this is what came to my mind as I was looking at this and trying to find these 7 states. Now, 5 of these conditions, you can almost identify them like denominations. Number 3, you can say this belongs to the Orthodox Church. Number 4, unmistakably under Roman Catholicism. Number 5, you can't miss number 5. Number 6, unmistakable. Number 7, very convincing. Somebody might present some arguments against it, but it's very convincing. But there are 2 of them, the first 2, which you cannot give a name to them. They are not denominations, but they are real conditions that exist in the world. And the thing about these two, number 1 and number 2, this is what I say about number 1 and number 2. When Christians are living under that condition, when Christians are living under these conditions, denominations become irrelevant. I don't know if any of you have ever read Richard Wurmbrand's book, Tortured for Christ. Okay, Richard Wurmbrand was a Romanian Christian who lived under the time of communism. And he was put in prison for his faith and tortured. A lot of Christians were imprisoned during that time. And Richard Wurmbrand said something interesting. He said that in jail, when they were in prison in Romania, there were no Catholics, there were no Adventists, there were no Jehovah's Witnesses, there were no Baptists. Everybody was Christian. because the suffering that they were all going through together broke down the walls and just made them brothers in Christ. And that is why I am making these two conditions different from the other conditions. Like I said, there is overlapping, because you can be in the Orthodox Church and you can still be persecuted by the state. So that's why I said there's some kind of overlapping. But you have these 5 very clear conditions from number 3 to number 7. And then you have number 1 and number 2, which is like some general conditions, but they are very real and they exist in the world. And I think that these 7 conditions will continue until the very end of time. Until Jesus comes again, you will have other religions persecuting Christians. And so you'll have those Christians who are, you could say they are non-denominational because of the condition they live in. And then you have those Christians who live under persecuting states like China and North Korea and some Islamic countries, where again, their denomination hardly matters because they are common in that they are suffering together. And these are 2 classes that continue until right down to the very end of time. And then you have those who are in denominational groups: Orthodox, Catholicism, Protestantism, the Little Book movement, and then the movement that is in apostasy. And they are all distinct groups that you can identify. And they continue until we come down to the last moments of time, when everything comes to the crisis. Then you have maybe different different ways that they are organized based on how the crisis develops. But this is what I see right now as my best explanation of these 7 churches. But I see Brother Ian has his hand up. So Brother Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, I don't know if what you said last was touching on the answer that I'm looking for, the question I'm about to ask. But how do you, when you read the characteristics of the church Philadelphia and you compare it to the 144,000, there's some amount of parallelism, or what I would say,
overlapping.
Yeah. So how would the other churches fit into the 144,000 scenario, seeing that that is going to be the group of people who are going to be on the earth in the last days?
All right. The answers to some of those questions will have to wait until we get into the details of the churches, because we would have to go through them individually here now to clarify some of the questions. That should wait until we actually get to the churches. But just to say briefly, there comes a point in time when all of this disappears. And that is at the time of there's a process in which the 144,000 is being developed. So during this time, we still have the groups, but then you come to a time now where the 144,000 is fully made up. Anybody who is left is in Babylon. The rest of Christianity is now categorized as Babylon, because they have all departed from this focal point at the 144,000. God is bringing the 144,000 to. Every true Christian will come to that place. And now they're all in Philadelphia. So at that time, I think the church distinctions may just kind of fall apart, and we just have Babylon and the remnant. But up to that point in time, we have these 7 stages. That's what I would say.
So would you say at this point that it's the mark of the beast that will determine that?
Yes, the mark of the beast is a great turning point. Yes. Sister Esther's question about Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Amish. Now, that's a tricky question, because I have my question as to whether Mormons are Christians at all. I'm reluctant to label them as Christians. But if we call Catholics Christians, I suppose we need to label Mormons as Christians as well. And certainly Jehovah's Witnesses. Now, they fall under Protestantism, because you have those 3 great groups: Orthodox, Catholicism, and Protestantism. Protestantism, you see, the assumption is this. The categorizing goes like this. In the beginning, there was one Christian church. The way that history is looking at it, there was one Christian church, and this church was the Roman Catholic Church. Okay, they are looking at the public face of religion. The public faith was Roman Catholicism. Roman Catholicism broke into two. So now you have two faces. You have the Orthodox Church and you have the Roman Catholic Church. Now, along the way, you began to have groups breaking away primarily from Roman Catholicism. And this was because of the Reformation. So you have what was called the Protestants, where they protested against Catholicism. So now you have another branch of Christianity, which is made up of all these many groups who come into existence because they are protesting against Catholicism. So that covers all the other Christian groups. So that would embrace the Amish. They definitely came out during the Reformation. The Mennonites, the Amish, the Anabaptists, the Waldensians. Yeah, and even if we're going to put Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses in the Christian category, yes, they would fall under Protestantism. Let's close off with prayer, and then we're going to dismiss for today.